Thank you very much to the organizers for having me. I'm going to present joint work with Eleonora Guarnieri on male dominance and cultural extinction. So what we want to understand is why do some cultures and their associated norms prevail and others go extinct? So the answer to this question is key for understanding patterns of cultural diversity around the world. Cultural extinction can be the result of the physical loss of the population, or it can be the result of some cultural assimilation also. The abandonment of their cultural specific practices in favor of others, the collapses of social entity, etc. And in turn, these processes can be triggered by internal dynamics within a group. They can experience natural disasters, genocides, or it can be triggered by intergroup competition through several forces, globalization, colonization, wars, conflict, or most likely through a combination of both, right? What do we know about cultural extinction? Actually, very little, at least from like the economics discipline, because it's inherently challenging, right, to study cultural extinction, because it's very difficult to learn whether and when a cultural group has gone extinct. All we observe is what it's like prevailed. So how do we overcome this? We address this by using language extinction as a proxy for cultural extinction, right? So for many of you, these two terms would be analogs. Actually, in the literature, language is an important barrier of culture, right? That it's intergenerationally transmitted, and it's often used to define ethnic boundaries. And also, if you look at the determinants for language extinction, they're pretty much the same as the determinants for cultural extinction, right? Some indigenous groups, when we're colonized, were experienced like genocide epidemics that got rid of them. So it can be also population loss, or it can be language assimilation, right? Like the Cornish people in the UK. So it's pretty much the same determinants. Okay, so what's our hypothesis? Our hypothesis is that groups organized around male dominant socioeconomic structures are more likely to survive. And the way we're going to be thinking about male dominance or gender norms or gender roles, it's a little bit different than also part of my other work about looking at gender norms, maybe regarding, I don't know, work or something more fundamental, something that speaks to the very socioeconomic structure of a society. So how do men and women organize their families? How they organize their economic subsistence activities, right? So the way we're going to measure male dominance is through the male dominance index, which we did in our previous work, and it's based on ancestral traits related to either economic activities, so for instance, reliance on plow agriculture versus gathering, and on family arrangements. For instance, whether inheritance is passed through the maternal line or the paternal line, etc. I'll tell you more about it.
Just thinking about your first slide, I mean, a particular culture can die, and yet the language can survive. I mean, right? Because they conquered other places, like, you know, maybe the original Spanish culture is no longer there, but you still speak Spanish in many, many places.
Yes.
So to me, it's not clear. I think you're going to undercount. You're not going to overcount. So you're going to be undercounting the extinction of cultures by not taking into account the fact that languages spread, but languages may spread, and yet the culture may not be the same.
I see. Yes, obviously, what we're using here is a proxy, right? It's the best proxy that we could actually measure and work with. There will be, of course, cases in which either one or the other prevailed, and and not the other. So probably looking for some validation, some anecdotes, some narratives, or some cases in which one might have prevailed and not the other can help you make the case and convince that this is actually a good proxy.
Yeah, I'm just saying it's biased in only one direction.
In only one direction. So if anything, yeah, thanks. Okay, so what I'm showing now is at the language group level, the level of male dominance of each language group, right? And maybe it's surprising, maybe it's not. Darker shades of blue represent more male dominant societies, and lighter shades of blue represent more gender equal societies, right? So this is also the first time that we're able to do this at the ethnic group level for like non-contemporary measures of gender roles, right? What happens when we overlay which of these languages have gone extinct? This is actually the empirical pattern that helps us formulate our hypothesis, right? Why is it that more gender equal groups are being wiped out from the world? So you're probably wondering, as we did, why, right? Why is the relationship between male dominance and cultural extinction? So here we follow a very broad framework in the literature that really thinks about these internal factors or this intergroup competition, right? So in the intragroup dynamics, the way we're going to think about it is, well, maybe this is about some compounding factors or some mediators. Maybe this is because gender equal groups happen to settle in locations closer to the equator, for instance, or in places that have lower caloric suitability, right? So we might want to account for those. Also, it can be a little bit more complicated, more endogenous, more about the interplay of male dominance to institutions that might have fostered or hindered economic development. For instance, maybe societies that are more politically complex are also more male dominant, right? Those two might be highly correlated. On the intergroup dynamics, the way we're going to think about it is, well, maybe male dominance may determine the group's propensity to conquer, to expand, to be military aggressive. Maybe they have greater state capacity, stronger armies, and on the other hand, maybe more gender equal groups are more permeable to cultural assimilation or more vulnerable to attacks, right?
Just a quick question. So you are linking male dominance to individualism or not? So that the idea is
Not directly.
not direct.
No, not directly.
Because I mean we know that individualism is
Yes,
linked.
no, that's a good point. We don't do that direct link.
Did you tell us if you measure male dominance?
Not yet. I just told you that we're gonna look at ethnic traits. It's actually 10 ethnic traits that the literature has identified as being related to male dominance and gender equality and run a PCA.
Because to think about confounders, it would be useful to know how it's, how you're defining it.
Yes, yes, we'll get there. Yes.
Male dominance is related to like family ties like how many wives can you have in the first combination?
The male dominance index is going to be related by family size and family arrangement because it encompasses the family type, for instance, nuclear family, polygamy, matrilineality. So it's going to be in there.
Sorry, looking at the map before, I was thinking about like the selection of the sample in the sense that I don't know when are these cultures of nature, what is the year, also the year of extinction, because I can be thinking about also
Yes, no, of course, that is a great point, and cultural extinctions have been happening for thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, right? With the data we have, I will show you in a little bit that our cultural extinctions are mostly concentrated in the last 120 years. We don't know of the ones that happened like in previous even like eras, but so we're going to be focusing on that, and we're going to be looking at the ethnic traits from the ethnographic atlas, which claims to kind of collect this information prior to colonial contact or industrialization. Okay, so the way we're gonna kind of try to link this very broad conceptual framework to our data is by having two types of empirical analysis. First, we're going to look at the absolute level of male dominance within a cultural group, and we're going to be controlling for all these deep-rooted and institutional factors that the literature has identified as related to economic development or the collapse of societies. And second, we're going to focus more on these intergroup dynamics. In this part is where I will be able to talk a little bit more about mechanisms here, because we will be able to test what is a stronger predictor, right? The relative distance in male dominance between the colonizer and the indigenous group, or other types of distances. So sorry, I should say first that for this type of exercise, we're gonna exploit the shock of European colonization to get to this dyadic setting in which we can relate each indigenous language to the colonizer that contacted them. Any questions? Okay, so let me very quickly talk about the literature and the contributions of this paper. First, we contribute to the interdisciplinary work on language loss, right? Linguists have been working on that for a very long time, but we didn't have like a data set that systematically compiled information to allow a global analysis. So we're contributing with this, and we're contributing by putting forward a novel hypothesis about a new determinant potentially of language extinction. Second, we're contributing to mostly economic literature on ethno-linguistic diversity and cultural evolution, to which many of you have contributed. But within this literature, what we realize is that the papers have been looking at either at the formation of cultural groups, at the evolution of cultural norms within groups, or more recently, at the within group cultural heterogeneity. But we're kind of the first to focus on really the disappearance of established cultural fields. Third, we are also speaking to the literature on the consequences of European colonization. So the papers, and I'm here just taking a foundational ones looking at comparative development. They've been focusing either, on initial factor endowments, legal origins, the type of institutions that were brought by the Europeans here. We're shifting the dependent variable, right? Instead of comparative development, we're looking almost at the opposite, at cultural extinction, and we're really placing the focus on a cultural determinants, on the type of socioeconomic structures that were brought with them that were more male-centered than the societies that they encountered. Okay, so let me tell you about the data we use. So we start with the universe of known languages. This is how they define a language. Every distinct human language that has been documented, whether living or extinct, whether it's primary modality spoken, written, or signed. There are more than 8,000. And then the key thing is going to be that the ethnologue, the most authoritative source for language information from linguists, has an edition that incorporates information on the language vitality of each of the languages, right? So they develop a scale that can take values between 0 and 10. This is called the expanded rated intergenerational disruption scale. And basically, this is what we take to define whether a language has gone extinct. So there are, as you can see, all these categories. A language can be very vigorous, used at the national, provincial, educational level. Here it starts to shift into being threatened, shifting more and more. We take these last three categories, merely extinct, dormant, or extinct, in which it's clear that the intergenerational transmission has been halted. And this is how we define our dependent variable. Right? We're going to run robustness tests, taking more or less categories, and nothing is going to be.
I mean, it depends I mean, it just depends on so many things. If you think about Hebrew, for example, if you had looked at Hebrew in the 1930s, you would probably have found it nearly extinct. I don't know, I'm gonna guess. And now, of course, it's a vibrant language because the state of Israel exists.
Exactly.
So that would be one contingency. It depends really a lot when you're doing it. The other is, take dialects spoken in little villages in Italy, where people are leaving the towns, and there's
Yes.
basically only old people in these towns. And that you're gonna find nearly extinct, and it's a lot has to do with the process of development
Yes,
and what made these villages far less attractive for people than living in a big city. All I'm just saying is that there's a lot of reasons this might happen,
yes.
and
And that the time in which you are measuring it matters.
it matters tremendously. And, the people who did this, to do this, they had to be able to find the language.
Yes,
And so they're gonna be missing a lot of things that are prior to the 1850s.
Who were not written. Who were not written.
Yeah, or were not written, or just, prior to 1850s, and not, a lot of places didn't have a written language. prior to
Yes.
1850s. So,
yes. No, and it's a good point. I'm sure we can do more in the paper to kind of try to validate also this. For now, we kind of feel comfortable by taking what is the best kind of body of knowledge about languages, taking into account that this is an edition, right, that was published recently, that is based on information at a certain point that might be incomplete.
I guess I'm not really asking so much for robustness, I'm asking to think, what way would it bias results
Okay,
to measure these things at one time? So the fact that, even if certain languages were written down, if they weren't written down in stone and they're written down in wood, they would not survive.
Yeah.
That, to think about the sources of bias and how it might affect the result.
I see, I understand. Yes, thank you.
This may be controversial, but so how are, say, Chinese dialects counted? Are they all like part of a single language? Or?
So the ethnologue only contains information about languages, no dialects, and not, like use secret languages, slang. They have to be used in different dimensions and through different demographic groups. Now, the fact that you might consider something a dialect and the ethnologue considers it a language, that might be the case, but we just take their definition of languages, that does not include that.
So is Basque a language, is Catalan a language?
Yes, those are languages, yeah, by all.
Because many would argue that the distances between dialects in Chinese could be, like, at least in the spoken language, could be much larger than many distances, say, like among European languages.
Because they come from different family trees or.
No, there's just like they sound very different.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I mean, we could set those particular dialects, but in principle, this is only about languages, not
Yeah,
dialects.
so what I mean is that the definition of what is a language can at times be
Yes.
Culturally different.
enormous and cultural.
Yes, yes, yes. No, I understand. And also the reason of why, like this, there is some discrepancies on whether they are 8,000 languages in the world by some accounts, by others 6,000, is because often one language has different ways to refer to that language. So that might like overcount. So yeah, that is also one of the things. Okay, so we find if we measure them this way, 11% of the languages as of today are considered extinct. And our sample consists in 4,750 languages in 172 countries. So our unit of observation is a language in a country, right? So English in the UK, English in the US, Spain in Spain, Spain in Mexico, etc. The timing of extinction that you were asking me to, so we don't have information for all the extinct languages, and often it's approximate, but this is how the distribution looks like. So as I said, it's mostly concentrated in the last 150 years. Okay.
Can you say something about how you selected that sample? Because I would imagine it's either more countries or far fewer. So for example, you only look at the colonies. That would be also something. Why did you decide to have those 170?
No, we don't we don't pick out the countries, we just take whatever is left after like our sample restrictions, which are not about countries. When we move to the colonization exercise, then we will focus only on countries that were colonized and only on indigenous languages. So our sample size will be smaller, but here for now, we're gonna start with a very like exploratory analysis where we'll consider everything.
And maybe that's a low hanging fruit and it's not this comment, but clearly, all of this is very much loading towards the last period closer to us. So whatever you're going to say as a relationship between male dominated societies and extinction is going to be contextual to the world in the second half of the 20th century, right? So we could have the hypothesis that maybe in the 15th century, the extinction of languages and cultures are driven by different factors than in a world that is now globalized, post-colonial, and so on. Right. So I wonder how much you can speak to, how much do these circumstances.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And I guess for that, we would need to speak about the dynamics of language extinction, right? It's not the case that a language goes directly from like being national to being extinct. This is an intergenerational process that at the very, very, very least takes 3 generations and often more, right? So we actually felt the opposite. We felt fairly confident that this was going to be the consequence of something that happened, after colonization, because it really takes time for culture to kind of express, for people to either assimilate or, perish, and for this cultural extinction really to be measured as such instead of
but then maybe another take on my comment would say, okay, what you're looking at is the ones that actually managed to survive until the 1960s. Maybe there are societies that were exposed to the same forces, but basically cracked down and faltered away much earlier on.
Yes.
In the 17th century.
Yes, no, for sure. Yes. Okay, so let's look at male dominance index. So we're going to use the ethnographic atlas. I'm sure like most of this audience knows about this source of information about 1,200 plus societies around the world. They're measured prior to European, to colonization or to industrialization, or if they like measured afterwards, the information it's supposed to be about ancestral traits. So I'm not gonna spend time telling you how we match these ethnic groups to the languages. We basically, for those that know these sources, we use direct matches through deep plays. And when we don't have direct matches, we use linguistic trees and an algorithm that assigns like the closest linguistic node upwards. You were also asking me about what is this index about? So we reviewed the anthropological and the economic literature and identified 10 ethnic traits that were related to notions of male dominance and gender inequality, right? Some of them, we have papers in economics like the plow, pastoralism, matrilineality, right? Others, the anthropological literature have identified them also. So based on this literature, we look at whether they are gender equal or male dominant. And then because we want to kind of have this multidimensional issue summarized into one index, we simply run a principal component analysis. And to the first component, we call it the male dominance index, okay?
I can say one thing on wording, but they're not gender equal societies.
Which one, sorry?
They're not gender equal. I mean, I don't know of a single society that's not, that was not to some extent male dominated. Single one.
Yes.
All
No.
positions of political power in any society that we've looked at have been men.
Yeah.
So I just don't want to, it's just a word.
It's a label, but
I
it's
don't want to call it
important.
gender equal.
It's important. Actually, in previous versions, the male dominance index was called the gender inequality index. And we were like, no, because this does not go in both directions, as you're saying, right? It's not that it can be gender unequal because it favors more women. It always goes in one direction. So we change it to that, but we can be more careful with the literacy. Okay, so because this is, as I said, the first time we come up with a male dominance index at the ethnic group level based on kind of ancestral information, we spend a lot of time and effort into validating it. So for instance, I can show you that it correlates well with contemporary survey measures of gender inequality. So we took the VHS and we looked at different measures of gender inequality, female employment, some preference, attitudes towards wife beating, intimate partner violence, and it does a good job into like correlating even when we introduce country fixed effects and a bunch of social demographic controls. And also, it correlates well with the male dominance bias done by, Melanie and Stelios in the folklore paper. I'll show you later results in which we use their male dominance index instead of ours. So we're really like confident that we're capturing this gender dimension, that it's also correlated to the gender inequality today as we measure it commonly in the literature. Okay, so I'm going to start with a very simple OLS analysis in which the dependent variable is going to be an indicator variable that is a value 1 if that language at that country is extinct, 0 otherwise, and then the male dominance index is going to be our variable of interest, which is defined at the language level. And then what we're going to do is we're going to control from the arguably more exogenous to more endogenous for all these known factors for economic development or collapse. And we also spent a lot of time coding them. We have geography, latitude, distance to coast, elevation, ruggedness, caloric suitability, climate and disease, natural resources, natural disasters, historical conflict, and also kind of institutions such as whether the society was nomadic or settled, and their degree of political complexity, like the number of hierarchies beyond the local community.
Yeah, because in the image that the weather, I think there are like third factors or other factors that happening, so whether agriculture, instead of gathering, and those things, those fundamental things can of course all very much influence how reliable our solar is.
Yes.
And if there is agriculture, so then it's more, it's less likely to change because we experience it moving around.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the plow is part of the index, but I think that what you're saying is that independently it can have an effect, no, on the likelihood of survival.
Yeah, not only that, but how much they rely on agriculture compared to the range of.
Yeah, yeah. So what we do is, so this dependence on agriculture, dependence on gathering, on fishing, etc., are going to be part of the index, right? So what I can show you is a horse race of what happens when I additionally control for these factors in the regression. Like I additionally control for that, and it still looks like the male dominance index is doing most of the explaining. But of course, what I cannot capture in kind of a linear regression is all these very complex interactions and mediators and confounders.
I think that what he's saying is that if you're, for example, relying on gathering and not agriculture, maybe if you have animal migration, whatever, you're less likely to survive. And so that might in and of itself be the characteristic that leads you to be less likely to survive, just because it's maybe it's a less stable indicator. But I think your answer to that would be, it's not that they have to be that way now. I mean, they don't have to stay as hunter-gatherers. They could change, but you're going to be taking whether they're hunter-gatherers at the moment that this was done. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
Not only violent, but the like if you have a strong or that means the ability like staying and the impact is sometimes gathering and gathering, moving around and then make more association.
Yes. So I mean the best thing that we think for now we can do, because these are all important points, is to kind of compare two societies that are either both sedentary or both nomadic, and look at the variation in their gender dimension, right? And of course, we can make discussions on whether, we're measuring things at a certain point in time, and maybe at that time the gathering societies are like not so well represented in that sample because they have like experienced extinction already. There is maybe more than we can argue along those lines. But in terms of empirical analysis, I mean, yeah. Okay, so let me show you what we find. We start with the bivariate correlation. This is just the correlation between the MDI and the extinction. And then we add sequentially, like the most exogenous geography, then climate and disease, and natural resources, disasters, historical conflict, and this index of political complexity and nomadic versus sedentary. And by and large, the coefficient remains negative, significant, and sizable. One thing that we also do is we run this with country fixed effects. So we're netting this off not only of these deep-rooted non-determinants, but of like national policies, language policies that affect all languages within a country, colonial history, etc. And the effect, of course, the magnitude kind of is smaller, but it persists, right? We can also do the course rates, even though maybe I was misinterpreting your point, but we also kind of control for these important things that the literature has shown that might kind of foster economic development and gender norms at the same time, and nothing seems to change.
And sorry,
Yes.
so one clarification. Can it be that is just globalization, trade, we need to speak all the same language? And this is interacting with male dominance.
The globalization?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, globalization is one of the forces that the linguists are pointing at as driving extinction. I cannot really speak too much at what is driving this in this analysis. So maybe if I move to the other exercise, we're able to see a little bit more. Yes.
What happens if you exclude all the each country's dominant language, main language? It seems that the main language of each country also is associated with the national history and all that, so there's actual force to stay alive together with the country. And it would be really nice if you could see that, but among the secondary languages in a country, the one that is associated with high colonial dominance also is like.
That's a good point. Okay, we'll have time to show you, but also when we use the control measure, it's
So in our measure, I think we had like 8 components or something. Are you taking some of these components to build this index, or you are actually taking the male bias variable, which actually is broader than male dominance?
So
Yeah.
when we take the male dominant bias, we just take your measure. Directly.
So yeah, I think it would be more interesting if you narrow it down to like, the more related components, because our measure is more like all the stereotypes.
Yes, but
Usually you apply, yeah.
that's also what we like, right? That we're measuring gender from a specific dimension, you from a very different one, but kind of the results go in the same direction. But yeah, we can look into those.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, I think there is like a specific component is just about male is dominant as well, but but obviously I think it would be okay to include the male is violent, that sort of thing, because it's related to yours.
And yeah, we can do that. Okay, let me then rush because I think this is going to be the most interesting part and I only have a few minutes. So we're gonna focus now on this intergroup competition, intergroup relations that actually linguists point at the most likely cause for language extinction. And for that, we're gonna leverage European colonization, and that is anyway identified as a major cause of cultural extinction together with globalization, but that comes later. And we generate a dyadic data set in which we relate each indigenous language to the colonizer that contacted them, right? So to give you a sense, because here we're able to speak a little bit more about mechanisms, and since this is a conference about narrative, right? We've been reading a lot of these narratives. These are the Quakers going to North America, but the Spaniards going to Colombia would have a very similar narrative. So here come the colonizers with their patriarchal view of the world, which is male-centered in the sense that men are the main providers, the main breadwinners. Women are supposed to be at home, right? So if women were in charge of shifting agriculture, that's no longer accepted. It's no longer accepted to live in extended kinship formats. It's no longer accepted to have matrilineal lineage, etc., etc. So they shift this. These societies had achieved their balance with these traits that were well adapted to this environment. And when this clashes with the new structure that is imposed, these civilizations, some of them are not able to make it, right? So we're going to start with a very simple, with a very similar regression to the one I presented before, but here we're going to test not only the absolute level of male dominance, but the distance from the indigenous language to the colonizer. And we're also going to unpack this difference by looking at whether the colonizer was more male dominant than the indigenous group, most of the cases, but also whether the indigenous group was more male dominant than the colonizer, right? So we start by validating our previous result in a slightly smaller sample because now we only have countries that were colonized in indigenous languages, and we find the same effect. Column 2 is very interesting because it's suggesting that what matters is the intergroup factors rather than the absolute level of male dominance of a society. So this is already very interesting. We move here, we start to unpack of what matters more, what's part of this absolute distance. What matters more, regardless of whether you look at them together separately, is when the indigenous language is more gender equal than the colonizer, right? We can look at this from the other perspective, like taking the male dominance of the colonizer, and this is going to also allow us to include colonizer fixed effects. So here we expect the opposite sign, which is what we observe, right? Your indigenous language is more likely to go extinct if the colonizer who contacted you was more male dominant. Again, here, what matters is when the colonizer is more male dominant than you, and this is not due to the British colonization, the Spanish colonization. Within these colonizers, we find a very similar effect of this cultural distance in male dominance on your likelihood of dominance.
I feel like you're interpreting it as almost like a ability to, I don't know, not conflict, but to, well, you're saying it's because, yeah, it's maybe there's some conflict thing, but you don't have the population size here.
No.
And I would be wondering if more male dominant societies would be more spread out because they would have conquered more places. And therefore therefore they're larger, and therefore they're more likely to survive when any foreign group comes in. Rather than, we have a small group of colonizers coming in, but it's a very small society.
Yeah.
So is there any way to take into account either population or distance, spread of the population and over area?
We're trying,
in other words?
yes, we're trying to get some estimates of the population, like the pre-colonial population. We're trying to get that, not easy, but yes, precisely because of this. Thank you. Okay, so let me very quickly, then I think this is also a very interesting part. We're pushing the male dominance distance, but this might be reflecting more general cultural distance, right? Maybe it's because we just culturally distant in general, not so much about male dominance. So what we do is we look at linguistic distance, and actually linguistic distance does not predict the likelihood of extinction. For here, I have to warn you, we need to focus only on where we have variation in linguistic distance. So it's a smaller sample, but still we validate our result. And then when we look at the effect of linguistic distance, it's basically 0. And it's all about this male dominant dimension. What we also do is we look at political complexity. Okay, 0. I just tell you this and then I'll conclude. So our worry is this, okay, our male dominant society is more politically complex, greater state capacity, greater armies. Maybe this is explaining everything, right? So indeed, when we compute the distance in political complexity, you can see it here. It does predict higher distance in political complexity predicts higher probability of extinction. But when we run a horse race between the distance in political complexity and the distance in male dominance, the largest effect, if you look at standard deviations, this is 4 times larger than the distance in political complexity. So we believe that this is something that goes beyond kind of state capacity, military capacity, and is about some socioeconomic structure. I don't have time to go through the narratives that we compiled also for this conference, and because we're really interested in capturing what was going on, right? They arrived, they imposed the plow, they banned matrilineality, they outlawed polygamy, they did all these things that were part of their culture, they were like what was well adapted to those societies, and that obviously undermined their equilibrium and eventually make them more likely to go extinct in some cases. So what we find is that the larger the mismatch, the larger the probability of going into extinction. So I think I'm really out of time. So I'll leave you with the slide, and thank you very much for your time.